The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the air already carried that sticky summer weight, thick, slow, and heavy with the smell of oil and hot asphalt. In the back corner of a modest auto repair shop on the edge of town, a 17-year-old kid wiped grease off his hands with a rag that had seen better days. His t-shirt clung to his shoulders, damp from hours already spent under the hood of a beat-up sedan. Outside, the world was just waking up, but he'd been working since before dawn. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. There was something about fixing things, about taking something broken and making it run again that felt like magic. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, squinting at the screen through tired eyes. It was Ray, the old mechanic who'd taken him under his wing a few years back, the one who'd taught him that every engine has a voice if you learn how to listen. The call went straight to voicemail, but a text followed seconds later. Gulfstream down at Cedar Ridge. Hydraulic leak. Crew's panicking. I'm stuck here with Mrs. Langley's transmission. She's got chemo at 9. You're the only one I trust. Keys are under the mat. Go. Cedar Ridge wasn't just any airstrip. It was private, gated. The kind of place where people arrived in helicopters or stepped off jets wearing sunglasses worth more than most cars. He'd never been past the security booth. But Ray didn't ask, he knew. And that meant something. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his worn canvas tool bag, slung it over his shoulder, and locked up the shop. The old pickup Ray kept for emergencies sputtered to life on the third try. As he drove, the city faded behind him, replaced by open fields and quiet roads lined with tall pines. His mind raced not with fear but with focus. He'd never worked on a jet before, not up close, but he'd spent countless nights poring over aviation manuals borrowed from the library, watching repair videos, sketching diagrams in the margins of his school notebooks. Ray always said, a machine is a machine. Whether it's got wheels or wings, it obeys the same laws. By the time he pulled up to the Cedar Ridge gate, the sky had lightened to pale gold. The guard, a broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform, eyed him skeptically. You lost, son? I'm here for the Gulfstream, he said, keeping his voice steady. Ray sent me. The guard frowned, radioed someone, then stepped back with a nod. Hangar 3. Don't touch anything you shouldn't. He parked near a sleek silver jet that gleamed like liquid metal in the morning light. Even from a distance, he could see the problem. A dark stain pooling beneath the left wing, shimmering faintly with the iridescent sheen of hydraulic fluid. 2 crew members paced nearby, talking in low, urgent tones. One spotted him and walked over, arms crossed. Who are you? Ray's apprentice, he replied, not offering a name. He said there's a leak. The man sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, right before the CEO's supposed to leave for New York. We've got less than an hour. Mind if I take a look? The crew exchanged glances. They didn't have much choice. With a reluctant shrug, one of them waved him forward. Be careful. This isn't some junker from the side of the road. He smiled faintly but didn't argue. He knew the difference. But he also knew that pressure didn't scare machines, and it shouldn't scare people either. He dropped his bag and knelt beside the puddle. The smell was sharp, chemical, unmistakable. He traced the line upward, fingers brushing along the belly of the aircraft until he found it. A hairline crack in a high-pressure hose near the landing gear assembly. Not catastrophic, but enough to ground the plane. Standard procedure would be to replace the entire line, but that required parts they didn't have on site and time they didn't have to wait. But Ray had taught him another rule. When the book fails, use your head. He unzipped his bag and pulled out a roll of high-temp sealant tape, a compression sleeve and a set of micro-wrenches he'd modified himself. His movements were calm, deliberate. He cleaned the area with a solvent wipe, dried it with compressed air from a portable canister he always carried, then wrapped the crack with 3 layers of tape, securing it with the sleeve and tightening it just enough to hold without crushing the line. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold for a flight. He'd seen similar fixes in military field manuals, where improvisation meant the difference between mission success and failure. As he worked, he didn't notice the black SUV rolling up behind him, didn't hear the door open, didn't see the man in the tailored suit step out, briefcase in hand, eyes scanning the scene with growing impatience until that man stopped dead in his tracks, because something caught his eye. Around the kid's neck, tucked under his t-shirt but visible when he leaned forward, was a small silver pendant, 2 wings curving outward from a central shield, with a propeller etched in the middle. Vintage. Unmistakable. the kind issued to pilots who trained before the 1960s, before commercial aviation opened its doors to everyone. The CEO, Julian Cross, though no one had said his name, stood frozen. He hadn't seen that symbol in decades, not since his own grandfather, a man who'd flown reconnaissance missions over the Pacific, had pressed it into his palm before his first solo flight. "Wear it when you're scared," the old man had said. "It'll remind you you're not alone." Now, here it was, on the chest of a teenager kneeling in grease-stained jeans, fixing a $500,000 jet with tools that looked like they'd been salvaged from a junkyard. Julian walked closer, slowly, almost reverently. The crew turned to greet him, but he held up a hand, silencing them. He watched as the kid finished tightening the last clamp, wiped his hands and stood. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Julian asked, voice softer than anyone on his team had ever heard it, "Where did you get that necklace?" The kid touched the pendant instinctively as if remembering it was there. "My grandfather gave it to me," he said. "He was a flyer. Not the kind you see in movies, more the kind nobody talked about. But he loved the sky. Said it didn't care what color you were, only if you knew how to listen." Julian's throat tightened. He'd spent his whole life building empires in boardrooms and code. But in that moment, standing on a quiet tarmac with the hum of distant generators and the scent of jet fuel in the air, he felt something shift inside him, like a door opening to a room he'd forgotten existed. He glanced at the repaired line, then back at the kid. "Did you just fix my jet?" "I patched it," came the honest reply. "It'll hold for the flight, but you'll want a full replacement before the next long haul." Julian nodded slowly. Then to everyone's surprise, he smiled. "You ever been inside one of these?" The kid shook his head. "Then come on," Julian said, gesturing toward the aircraft stairs. "Let's make sure it's really ready, and tell me about your grandfather." As they walked toward the jet, the crew exchanged stunned looks. No one had ever seen Julian invite a stranger, let alone a teenager in oil-streaked clothes, onto his private plane. But something about the way the kid carried himself, the quiet confidence in his hands and his words, made it feel right. Inside, the cabin was all polished wood and soft leather, quiet as a library. Julian poured 2 cups of coffee from the built-in galley, real coffee, not the instant kind, and handed one over. They sat across from each other, the jet's engine still off, the world outside holding its breath. And as the kid began to speak, about late-night study sessions, about his grandfather's stories of flying over Alabama fields with nothing but stars for company, about how he'd saved every dollar from odd jobs to buy his first torque wrench, Julian listened. Not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, but as a man who suddenly remembered what it felt like to dream without a safety net. Outside, the sun climbed higher. The puddle of hydraulic fluid had nearly dried. The plane was ready, but no one was in a rush to leave, because sometimes the most important repairs aren't made to machines, but to the invisible things that connect people across generations, across worlds that seem too far apart to ever touch. And on that quiet morning, 2 lives, one just beginning, one already full of success, brushed against each other like wings in the wind, and neither would be the same again. The coffee was hot, smooth, and nothing like the burnt sludge he usually got from the gas station machine near the shop. He held the cup carefully, like it might vanish if he gripped it too hard. Across from him, the man in the suit, Julian, though he hadn't introduced himself yet, leaned back in his seat, watching him with eyes that weren't judging, just curious. "You said your grandfather was a flyer," Julian finally said, voice low, like they were sharing secrets instead of sitting in a $1 million jet, "but not the kind people talk about." The kid nodded, fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "He never got to fly commercial. Back then, even if you had the skill, the doors weren't open for folks who looked like us. But he didn't stop loving it. He'd sit on the porch every evening, pointing out planes in the sky, telling me what kind they were just by the sound of their engines. Said the sky didn't care about your last name or your skin. It only cared if you respected it." Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a young man in a flight suit, standing beside a propeller plane, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "My grandfather flew recon missions in the Pacific," he said. "Same era. Same silence when he came home. People thanked soldiers, sure, but pilots like him, they got forgotten." The kid looked at the photo, then at his own pendant. The design was nearly identical. Not a coincidence. Just two men from different sides of the same story, both loving something the world tried to keep from them. Something shifted in the air then. Not tension, but understanding. Like two puzzle pieces clicking into place without either of them trying. Julian set the photo down. You ever been up in one of these? No, sir. Call me Julian. And you? Just me, he said with a small smile. Names don't matter much when you're elbow deep in an engine. Julian chuckled. Fair enough. He stood and walked to the cockpit, motioning for the kid to follow. The flight crew was already inside, doing final checks. They glanced up, surprised, but didn't say anything. Julian's look told them this was fine. Show me what you did, Julian said. The kid stepped forward, pointing to the hydraulic line on the schematic screen. See this junction? That's where the crack was. I reinforced it with a field patch. High-temp sealant, compression sleeve, triple wrap. It'll hold pressure for at least 5 hours of flight time. But like I said, it's not permanent. You'll need a full line swap before any transatlantic trips. One of the pilots, a woman with sharp eyes and silver streaks in her hair, leaned in. You did that with what? A lunchbox toolkit? He shrugged. Tools don't fix things, people do. The rest is just metal. She raised an eyebrow, then nodded slowly. Kid's got a point. Julian crossed his arms, impressed. You learned all this from Ray? Mostly, but a lot of it. I just listened. Engines talk, you know. They groan when they're tired, hiss when they're leaking, hum when they're happy. My granddad used to say, if you can hear it, you can heal it. Julian looked at him like he was seeing something rare, something real. Not a prodigy, not a charity case, just a young man who paid attention to the world in a way most people forgot how to. He turned to the crew. We're good to go? The lead pilot gave a thumbs up. Hydraulics are stable. Pressure's holding. Whatever he did, it worked. Julian turned back to the kid. You should come with us. The offer hung in the air, unexpected. The kid blinked. Me on the flight? Why not? You fixed it. You deserve to see it fly. He hesitated. Not out of fear, but because this wasn't his world. He belonged in garages, not galleys. But then he thought of his grandfather, who'd never stepped foot inside a private jet, who'd watched them from the ground like distant dreams. All right, he said quietly. But just for the takeoff, Julian grinned. Deal. Minutes later, the engines roared to life, a deep, throaty growl that vibrated through the floor and up into his chest. He sat in the co-pilot jump seat, seatbelt tight, eyes wide as the plane taxied down the runway. The acceleration pressed him back, smooth and powerful. Then lift. The ground fell away. Trees shrinking to twigs, roads turning into thin gray threads. He didn't say a word, just watched. Breath caught in his throat as the world opened up below him. Julian watched him from the doorway. First time? He nodded, still staring out the window. Feels like the sky's been waiting. It has, Julian said softly. They leveled off at 35,000 feet. The flight would only take them as far as Chicago. Julian had a board meeting. But for the kid, it might as well have been the moon. He asked careful questions, how the avionics worked, how pilots communicated with towers, what it felt like to fly through a storm. The crew, initially wary, warmed to his genuine curiosity. The female pilot even let him listen in on a radio exchange with air traffic control. You've got a good ear, she told him. Ever think about flying yourself? I'd love to, he admitted. But flight school costs more than my whole neighborhood, Julian overheard. Didn't say anything then, but filed it away. When they landed in Chicago, the kid thanked them and stepped off the plane, back onto solid ground. Julian walked him to the hangar exit. You know, Julian said, talent like yours shouldn't be stuck guessing how to patch a jet with duct tape and hope. It wasn't duct tape, the kid said with a half smile. Close enough. Point is, you're good. Really good. And the world needs people who listen to machines like they're alive. The kid looked down at his boots, scuffed and oil-stained. I just like fixing things. Then let me help you fix bigger things, Julian said. There's a program, an aviation maintenance academy. Fully accredited. They train the techs for major airlines, private fleets, even NASA contractors. I know the director. I could get you in. The offer was generous. Too generous. The kid shook his head. I appreciate it. But I don't take handouts. It's not a handout, Julian said firmly. It's an investment. You've already proven you're worth it. All I'm doing is opening a door you earned the right to walk through. Still, the kid hesitated. What's the catch? No catch, but there is a condition. Here it comes, he thought. Julian smiled. This summer, my fleet needs a full systems review. 3 jets, 2 helicopters. I want you to lead the maintenance checks with supervision, of course. You'll get paid. You'll get certified hours. And if you impress me, which I have no doubt you will, you'll have a recommendation letter that'll get you into any program you want. It wasn't charity. It was a job. A real one. With expectations, accountability, and respect. The kid looked him in the eye. I'll need to talk to Ray. Of course, Julian said. Take the weekend. But don't say no just because you're proud. Pride keeps you grounded. Purpose lifts you. They shook hands, calloused palm meeting manicured one. And for the first time, the kid didn't feel like an outsider. He felt seen. Back home that night, he sat on his porch, the pendant cool against his skin. He called Ray. You did what? Ray laughed, half disbelieving. You fixed Julian Cross's jet? And he offered you a summer gig? Yeah, there was a long pause. Then Ray's voice grew serious. Listen to me. This ain't just about planes. This is about legacy. Your granddad never got his shot, but you're standing at the runway with the engines running. Don't let fear shut them off. The next morning, he texted Julian one word. Deal. By Monday, he was back at Cedar Ridge, not as a visitor, but as part of the team. They gave him a clean uniform, a new toolkit, though he kept his old one for sentimental reasons, and access to the maintenance logs. The crew treated him differently now, not with suspicion, but with quiet respect. Even the skeptical pilot who doubted him nodded when he walked in. Over the next few weeks, he worked harder than he ever had. He studied schematics late into the night, asked questions until he understood every system, double-checked every bolt. He didn't cut corners, didn't show off, just worked, steady, smart, and silent. Julian checked in occasionally, not to micromanage, but to see how he was doing. Once he found the kid asleep in the hangar, head resting on a toolbox, an open manual on his lap. He didn't wake him, just draped a jacket over his shoulders and left a protein bar on the bench. Word started to spread. Not loudly, just whispers among mechanics and pilots. There's this kid. Fixed Cross's jet with nothing but grit. Now he's running diagnostics on the whole fleet. People began to take notice. Not because Julian said so, but because the work spoke for itself. One afternoon, while inspecting the tail rotor on a Bell 429, he noticed a faint vibration pattern others had missed. It turned out to be a microfracture in the gearbox housing, something that could have led to catastrophic failure mid-flight. He flagged it immediately. The part was replaced. A potential disaster avoided. Julian heard about it that evening. He didn't throw a party, didn't make a speech, but the next day he handed the kid a key card. What's this? The kid asked. Hangar access. Full clearance. You're not just helping anymore. You're part of the core team. The kid didn't say much, just slipped the card into his pocket, where it sat next to his grandfather's dog tags. As summer wore on, something else changed. Kids from his old neighborhood started showing up at the fence, watching him work. Some asked questions. Others just stared in awe. He began inviting them in during lunch breaks, showing them how to read a torque spec, how to identify fluid types, how to listen to an engine's rhythm. He wasn't just learning anymore. He was teaching. And in those moments, kneeling beside a curious 12-year-old explaining how hydraulics mimic human muscles, he felt his grandfather's presence more than ever. Not as a ghost, but as a guide, Julian saw it too. One evening, as they stood watching the sunset paint the tarmac gold, he said, You know, I built companies to change the world. But watching you, I think you're going to change it in a way I never could. The kid looked at him. How's that? By making sure the next generation doesn't have to fight as hard to reach the sky. They stood in silence for a while, the hum of cooling engines filling the air. No grand declarations, no dramatic music, just two people from different worlds, united by a shared belief that skill, respect, and heart matter more than where you start. And as the first stars blinked awake overhead, the kid touched his pendant again, not as a relic of the past, but as a compass for the future. He wasn't just mending jets anymore, he was building wings. The summer heat had settled into a steady rhythm, long days, warm nights, and the constant hum of engines in the background like a heartbeat. The kid had fallen into a routine that felt more like purpose than work. Every morning he'd arrive at the hangar before sunrise, coffee in hand, tool bag slung over his shoulder like an old friend. He wasn't just fixing things anymore, he was learning how to see them whole. Not just bolts and wires, but the stories they carried, the lives they kept safe. Julian stopped by less often now, but when he did, it wasn't as a boss checking in. It was more like a mentor watching someone grow into their own skin. One afternoon, he found the kid elbow deep in the avionics bay of the Gulf Stream, tracing a wiring harness with the focus of a surgeon. "You ever think about flying it yourself?" Julian asked, leaning against the fuselage. The kid didn't look up. "Every day. But flying's different from fixing. You gotta trust the machine and yourself." "You've already done both," Julian said. "You just don't know it yet." Later that week, Julian made good on his word. A thick envelope arrived at the kid's apartment. Not emailed, not texted, but hand-delivered, sealed with wax like something from another time. Inside was an acceptance letter to the National Aviation Maintenance Institute, full tuition covered, plus a stipend for housing and books. At the bottom, in Julian's handwriting, "Your grandfather's sky is waiting. Don't keep it waiting long." He read it 3 times before letting himself believe it was real. But pride still tugged at him. He called Ray that night. "I don't want it to feel like I'm being handed something I didn't earn," he said, voice low. Ray chuckled. "Boy, you think Julian gives this to just anybody? You think he'd risk his reputation on someone who couldn't back it up? Nah, he saw what I've seen, what your granddad saw. You've been earning this since you were 10 years old, taking apart lawnmowers just to see how they ticked." The kid was quiet for a long moment. "Then what if I fail?" "Then you try again," Ray said simply. "But you won't, because you don't just fix things, you understand them." Still, the kid didn't accept right away. Instead, he doubled down on his work. If he was going to take this chance, he wanted to leave the hangar knowing he'd given everything. He started documenting every repair, every inspection, creating a personal logbook filled with sketches, notes, and lessons learned. He even began teaching a Saturday workshop for local teens, basic engine maintenance, safety protocols, how to read a manual without getting lost. Attendance grew. Word spread. Soon, the hangar's side office became an unofficial classroom. Whiteboards covered in diagrams, shelves lined with donated tools. Julian noticed. One Saturday, he showed up unannounced, standing in the back as the kid explained how a turbine engine compresses air to create thrust. The kids listened, really listened, because he didn't talk down to them. He spoke like he was sharing a secret, not lecturing. Afterward, Julian pulled him aside. "You're building something here. Just trying to pass it on," the kid said. "My granddad used to say knowledge locked away is wasted." Julian nodded. "Then let's make sure it's not locked away." A few days later, Julian announced a new initiative, the Skyline Pathways program. It would offer paid apprenticeships to young people from underserved communities, with full support, transportation, meals, mentorship, and a direct pipeline to certification programs. And he wanted the kid to help design it. "No way," the kid said at first. "I'm not a program director." "You're exactly who should be," Julian replied. "Because you've lived it." Reluctantly, he agreed. They spent evenings in Julian's office, not in a skyscraper, but in a quiet corner of the hangar converted into a workspace, mapping out curriculum, safety standards, even interview questions. The kid insisted on one rule: no experience required. Just curiosity and commitment. Applications poured in faster than they expected. Dozens of kids, some from neighborhoods even tougher than his, sent in handwritten letters, shaky videos, even voice memos explaining why they wanted a shot. One girl wrote, "My dad's a truck mechanic. I want to work on things that fly." Another boy said, "I've never been on a plane, but I watch them every night from my roof. I want to know how they stay up there." Reading those words, the kid felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. The first group of 10 apprentices started in late July. The kid trained them himself: how to hold a torque wrench, how to identify fluid leaks by smell, how to stay calm when something goes wrong. He didn't pretend to know everything. When he didn't, he said so, and looked it up together with them. One afternoon, during a drill on emergency hydraulic failure, one of the younger apprentices froze. "What if I mess up?" she whispered. He knelt beside her. "You will. Everyone does. But messing up doesn't make you a failure. Giving up does. And you? You're still here. That means you're already winning." She nodded, took a breath, and finished the simulation. Julian watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a quiet smile on his face. As the summer wound down, the kid prepared to leave for the institute. His apartment was half-packed, boxes labeled in neat handwriting. Ray came by to help, bringing a paper bag of his favorite peach cobbler from the diner down the street. "You're gonna do great," Ray said, handing him a small wooden box. Inside was a set of custom-made wrenches, each engraved with a tiny wing. "Made 'em myself. Took me 3 months. Figured you'd need tools that know your name." The kid's throat tightened. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he just hugged the old man, long and hard. The night before he left, he went back to the hangar one last time. It was empty, quiet, the planes resting like sleeping giants. He walked past each one, running a hand along their wings, thanking them silently for the lessons they'd given him. He stopped at the Gulfstream, the first one he'd ever worked on. Moonlight glinted off its silver skin. He pulled out his pendant and held it up, letting the light catch the wings. "I made it this far, Granddad," he whispered. "Now I'm going higher." The next morning, Julian picked him up in a simple sedan. No SUV, no driver, just the two of them. As they drove toward the train station, neither said much. But the silence wasn't awkward. It was full, of respect, of gratitude, of unspoken promises. At the platform, Julian handed him a duffel bag. "Extra uniforms. And a few books the Institute won't tell you to read, but you should." The kid shouldered the bag. "Thanks for all of it." Julian looked him in the eye. "Don't thank me. Thank the kid who showed up at dawn with a rag and a dream. That's who got you here." The train arrived with a low whistle. The kid stepped forward, then turned back. "Will you keep the program going?" "As long as there are kids who look up at the sky and wonder how to get there," Julian said. "And I expect you to come back and teach a class someday." "I will." He boarded the train, found a window seat, and watched as the station and Julian grew smaller in the distance. He didn't cry, but he did touch the pendant again, just to feel its weight. Hours later, as the train rolled through open countryside, he opened one of the books Julian had given him. Tucked inside the front cover was a note. "The sky doesn't belong to the rich or the famous. It belongs to those who dare to understand it. You've already earned your place in it. Now go learn its language." He leaned his head against the glass, watching clouds drift past like old friends. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing a dream. He was living it, and the best part? He wasn't alone. Back at Cedar Ridge, the first group of apprentices gathered for their morning briefing. One of them pointed to the empty spot where the kid used to stand. "Do you think he'll forget us?" a boy asked. The girl who'd frozen during the drill shook her head. "Nah, he said he'd be back, and he's the kind of person who keeps his word." She adjusted her new safety goggles, gifted by the kid on his last day, and turned to the Gulfstream. "All right," she said, stepping forward. "Who's ready to learn how to listen to an engine?" And just like that, the legacy kept flying. The Institute wasn't what he expected. It wasn't all gleaming labs and high-tech simulators, at least not at first. The first few weeks felt like drinking from a fire hose. Terms like FADEC systems, composite stress analysis, and bleed air architecture flew past him like jets he couldn't catch. He stayed up late, rereading chapters, redrawing schematics until his hand cramped, watching old FAA training reels on a cracked laptop he'd patched together with duct tape and hope. But he didn't complain. He remembered the hangar, remembered the smell of hot metal and the sound of Ray's voice saying, "If you don't understand it today, wrestle it till tomorrow." So he wrestled, and slowly, the fog lifted. By mid-semester, instructors started noticing. Not because he raised his hand the most, but because his work was clean, precise, and thoughtful. During a turbine disassembly lab, he spotted a hairline crack in a compressor blade that the automated scanner had missed. The lead instructor pulled him aside afterward. "You've done this before," he said, not as a question. "Not on this scale," the kid replied, "but I've listened to enough engines to know when they're lying." The instructor nodded, impressed. "You've got instincts. Don't let textbooks drown them." That became his rule. Learn the rules, but never stop trusting his ears, his hands, his gut. He wrote letters back to the hangar every Sunday, long, handwritten ones. Not emails, real paper, folded and stamped. He told them about the flight simulators that made him sweat, the cafeteria coffee that tasted like burnt tires, the late-night study sessions with classmates from all over the country, kids who'd grown up near airports, military bases, even remote Alaskan villages. They all had one thing in common: they loved machines that flew. And he told them about the dreams, not the kind you have while sleeping, but the kind that wake you up at 3 a.m. with your heart racing. Visions of standing on a tarmac in a crisp uniform, signing off on a plane that would carry hundreds of people safely across an ocean. He didn't say it out loud, but he wanted to be the person families never saw but always depended on, the quiet guardian in the shadows who made sure the sky stayed kind. Back at Cedar Ridge, the Skyline Pathways program was growing. The first group of apprentices had already completed their certification hours. 2 were hired full-time by regional carriers. 3 enrolled in community college aviation programs, and the girl who'd once frozen during a drill, she'd become the go-to for avionics troubleshooting. Julian made sure their success wasn't hidden. He invited local news crews, not for flashy headlines but for honest stories. No staged photos, no exaggerated claims, just real kids in grease-stained coveralls explaining how they'd rebuilt a fuel pump or calibrated a navigation system. The coverage was modest, but it sparked something. Other companies reached out. A regional airline offered to fund 10 more slots. A tool manufacturer donated full kits. The program wasn't just surviving, it was multiplying. One evening, Julian received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden model of a Gulfstream, hand-carved, every panel and window perfectly detailed. Tucked beneath the wing was a note. Built it from memory. Thank you for seeing me before I saw myself. He placed it on his desk, right next to the old photo of his grandfather. Meanwhile, the kid was facing his biggest test yet, the FAA airframe and power plant oral exam. It wasn't just about knowing answers. It was about explaining your reasoning under pressure, defending your judgment like your life, and others, depended on it, because it did. The day before the exam, he walked to the edge of the campus airfield and sat on the grass, pendant in hand. He closed his eyes and imagined his grandfather sitting beside him. "What do I do if I blank?" he whispered. The wind rustled the tall grass. No voice came, but a memory did. His granddad years ago teaching him to change oil in an old pickup. When you don't know what to do next, go back to what you know is true. The rest will follow. He opened his eyes. The sky was clear, endless. He knew what was true. The next morning he walked into the exam room calm. The examiner, a grizzled veteran with 30 years in the field, asked tough questions. About emergency procedures, about material fatigue, about ethical dilemmas when a boss pressures you to sign off on a questionable repair. The kid didn't recite textbook lines. He spoke like he was talking to Ray, clear, honest, grounded. "Safety isn't a checklist," he said at one point. "It's a promise, and I don't break promises." The examiner studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Pass." 2 weeks later, he held his FAA A&P certificate in his hands. Official, real, the first in his family. Maybe the first in his whole neighborhood. He didn't celebrate with parties. Instead, he boarded a bus back home. No train this time, no fanfare. Just him, his duffel bag, and a heart full of quiet pride. When he stepped off at the Cedar Ridge gate, the guard recognized him instantly. "Well, look who's back," he said, smiling. And in a uniform that actually fits. The hangar buzzed with activity. New apprentices, 24 now, moved with purpose, guided by the original group. And there, in the middle of it all, was the girl who'd once doubted herself, now leading a team through a pre-flight inspection with calm authority. She saw him and froze, then grinned so wide it lit up the whole bay. "You're back. Just for a visit," he said. "Got a class to teach," word spread fast. Within minutes, Julian appeared, not in a suit, but in a faded flight jacket and jeans. He didn't say much, just clapped the kid on the shoulder and handed him a clipboard. "Your classroom's ready." That afternoon, the kid stood in front of the group not as a student, but as an instructor. He didn't lecture. He asked questions, made them think. Had them crawl under a mock fuselage to find a fault he'd planted. A loose wire, a mislabeled valve. When they found it, he didn't praise them for being smart. He praised them for being thorough. Talent gets you in the door, he told them, but attention to detail keeps people alive. After class, Julian pulled him aside. "You're staying, aren't you?" "For a while," the kid said. "There's more I can give here than I can take." Julian smiled. "Good, because I've got a proposition." He led him to Hangar 5, a space that had been empty for years. Inside, covered in tarps, was a vintage 1940s Stearman biplane, its yellow paint faded but proud. "It belonged to my grandfather," Julian said. "Been sitting here since he passed. I never knew how to restore it. But I think maybe together we could." The kid's breath caught. This wasn't just a plane. It was a bridge between past and present, between two families who'd loved the sky in silence. "I'd be honored," he said. They started the next week. Every evening after classes, they worked on the Stearman, sanding wood, rewiring instruments, rebuilding the radial engine bolt by bolt. Julian learned to rivet. The kid learned the stories behind every scratch on the fuselage. They didn't talk much while working. They didn't need to. The rhythm of hammers, the smell of linseed oil, the shared focus. It was its own language. News of the project leaked. Local aviation clubs came to watch. Veterans brought their grandkids to see the old warbird come back to life. One elderly man, a former flight engineer, teared up when he saw the restored cockpit. "My brother flew one of these over Normandy," he said softly. "Never came home. But seeing it fly again, it feels like he's still up there." The kid made sure the man's name was engraved on a small plaque inside the cockpit. As fall turned to winter, the Stearman neared completion. The day before its test flight, the kid stayed late, polishing the last panel. Julian found him there, alone under a single hanging lamp. "You know," Julian said, "I used to think success was building something no one else had. Now I think it's helping someone else build what they were told they couldn't." The kid looked up, wrench in hand. "You gave me a chance." "No," Julian said. "You took it, and then you gave it to others. That's the real legacy." The next morning, the airfield was packed, not with reporters or investors, just people who cared. Apprentices, mechanics, neighbors, veterans. Even Ray showed up, leaning on a cane but standing tall. The kid and Julian taxied the Stearman to the runway. They'd decided Julian would pilot. The kid would ride shotgun, his first time in an open cockpit plane. The engine roared to life, a deep, throaty song from another era. As they lifted off, the crowd below shrank into a sea of upturned faces. The wind whipped at their goggles. The sky stretched in every direction, blue, endless, free. In that moment, the kid didn't think about certificates or job offers or even the future. He just felt the sky, his grandfather's sky, Julian's sky, his sky, and knew he belonged. And as the Stearman climbed, wings catching the sun, it wasn't just a plane flying. It was a promise kept. 2 years had passed since that first morning at the hangar, when the kid showed up with nothing but a rag, a wrench, and a necklace that carried someone else's dream. Now he stood on the same tarmac, but everything about him had changed. Not the way he carried himself, not the quiet focus in his eyes, but the weight of what he'd become. He wore a clean technician's uniform, the FAA patch stitched neatly on his shoulder, and his boots, still scuffed, but polished, clicked softly against the concrete as he walked toward the Gulf Stream. This wasn't just any flight. It was his first solo maintenance sign-off on a transcontinental jet. No supervision, no second guesses. Just his name on the logbook, his judgment on the line. He'd earned it the hard way, through late nights, failed exams, rebuilt engines, and the kind of pressure that either breaks you or forges you into something stronger. He ran his final checklist with the same care he'd learned from Ray. Fluid levels, tire pressure, avionics calibration, emergency systems, every step deliberate, every bolt accounted for. When he reached the hydraulic line, the very spot where it all began, he paused, not out of doubt but respect. He ran a finger along the new factory-installed hose, then smiled faintly. No patch this time, just clean, reliable engineering. But he'd never forget the day a field fix changed his life. Inside the cabin, the flight crew waited. They knew who he was now. Not just Ray's kid or Julian's project, but a certified A&P mechanic with a reputation for catching what others missed. The lead pilot, the same woman who'd once raised an eyebrow at his lunchbox toolkit, gave him a nod. "Ready when you are." He returned the nod. "She's good to go." As the engines powered up, he stepped back, clipboard in hand, and watched the jet roll toward the runway. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows and painting the wings gold. He didn't feel nervous, just proud. Proud that he'd kept his word. To Ray, to Julian, to his grandfather, and most of all, to himself. Later that evening, back at the hangar, a small group gathered in the workshop. Not for a celebration, but for a handover. The original Skyline Pathways apprentices, now full technicians, were training the next wave. And tonight, one of them would lead their first full inspection solo. The kid, no, not a kid anymore, stood in the back, arms crossed, watching. He didn't interfere, didn't hover, just observed the way Julian had once watched him. When the young apprentice hesitated on a fuel sensor reading, the kid didn't jump in. He waited, and sure enough, the apprentice double-checked the manual, recalibrated the probe, and found the error herself. Afterward, she turned, eyes wide. Did I do okay? He walked over, pulled a clean rag from his pocket, and handed it to her. You didn't just do okay. You listened. That's the hardest part and the most important, she beamed, clutching the rag like a trophy. Julian appeared in the doorway, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the diner down the road, the same place Ray used to get peach cobbler. He handed one to the now young man and leaned against a workbench. You know, Julian said, I used to think legacy was something you left behind after you were gone. But watching you, I think it's something you build while you're still here. The young man sipped his coffee. I just kept doing what felt right. That's the rarest thing there is, Julian said. Most people chase what looks impressive. You chased what mattered. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the hum of the hangar, the clink of tools, the murmur of instruction, the occasional laugh. It wasn't glamorous, but it was alive, full of purpose. Later that week, the young man visited Ray. The old mechanic's hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but his mind was sharp. They sat on the porch just like old times, watching the sunset paint the neighborhood in soft oranges and purples. You ever miss the garage? Ray asked. Every now and then, he admitted. But this feels like what I was meant to do, not just fixing planes, helping people believe they can reach them. Ray nodded, sipping his sweet tea. Your granddad would be proud. Not because you made it big, but because you brought others with you. The next morning, the young man drove to the local high school. He'd been invited to speak to the career exploration class. Not as a success story, but as someone who'd taken a winding road. He didn't talk about private jets or billionaire CEOs. He talked about listening, about showing up even when you're scared, about how a single act of trust, like Ray handing him the keys that morning, can change everything. Afterward, a quiet boy hung back. I like taking things apart, he said shyly. But everyone says I should go into coding, that it's the future. The young man knelt so they were eye level. The future needs people who understand how things work, whether it's code or carburetors. Don't let anyone tell you your hands aren't smart. He handed the boy a business card, not with a fancy title, just his name and the Skyline Pathways number. Come by Saturday. We'll take apart an old starter motor. No pressure. Just curiosity. The boy's eyes lit up. Really? Really. That Saturday the boy showed up. So did 3 others. And the hangar, once a place of exclusivity, now echoed with the sound of young voices asking questions, making mistakes, and learning that it's okay to not know, as long as you're willing to find out. As the months passed, the young man balanced his duties, signing off on corporate jets, mentoring apprentices, and even flying small maintenance runs himself. He'd finally gotten his pilot's license, not to impress anyone, but because his grandfather's voice still whispered in his ear, if you love the sky, learn to meet it halfway. One crisp October morning, he prepared for a routine ferry flight, moving a Citation CJ-3 from Cedar Ridge to a maintenance facility in Arizona. Standard procedure. Nothing fancy, but as he walked toward the plane, he paused at the hangar mirror. He adjusted his uniform, then touched the pendant still resting against his chest. It hadn't left him since that first day. He climbed into the cockpit, ran through the pre-flight checklist, and taxied to the runway. The tower cleared him for takeoff. He pushed the throttles forward. The engine responded with a smooth, powerful roar. Wheels lifted, ground fell away, and just like that, he was alone in the sky. Not as a passenger, not as a mechanic, but as a pilot. Below, Julian stood near the hangar watching the plane climb. He didn't wave, didn't cheer, just stood there, hands in his pockets, a quiet smile on his face. Beside him, Ray leaned on his cane, squinting against the sun. "He made it," Ray said. "He's just getting started," Julian replied. Up above, the young man leveled off at 28,000 feet. The world stretched out in every direction, quiet, vast, and full of possibility. He glanced at the horizon, then at the pendant glinting in the sunlight. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was carrying someone else's dream. He was living his own. And the sky? It didn't say no, it never had. It just waited for someone willing to listen, to work, to believe. And now, as the jet hummed steadily beneath him, carrying him toward the next chapter, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of 1,000 more, each one written by hands that dared to reach, hearts that refused to quit, and wings that finally learned how to fly.